sure that we're not going to be over broadcast by YouTube suddenly trying to play our conversation at us. But today we're here with Marie Brennan, who is, I don't know, I feel like you were just here, but at the same time, that was M.A. Carrick, so it's not quite the
same. And I mean, I think I was also here for Driftwood last year, so I've been around a bunch lately. Somehow I
That's
wound up with
okay. We like you a lot.
like 3 books coming out in 6 months. That's not the way my life normally goes.
Well, it's cool. It's cool. Very congratulations on the quick release.
Avalanche.
Sounds like quick. But that's really neat. That's really neat. So the book we're talking about today is The Night Parade of 100 Demons, which is behind you right now.
Yes.
And so I'm very, very intrigued about this because I got to peek at it, and I'm a huge Japanophile. Marie knows this because we've sat together on panels before and each independently talked about our experience with Japanese and such. And so here we are, and yay. So I'm completely sucked in and I'm really enjoying the story. But I am noticing that it's connected with Legend of the Five Rings. Mm-hmm. So can you tell us a little bit about the connection with that?
Yeah, I mean, so this is a high-end novel, and the thing I've been trying to make sure everybody knows is that even if you don't know L5R, that's fine. You don't need to know it in order to enjoy the novel.
This is definitely true. I can confirm.
Yeah, the Aconite, the company that is putting out these books, is making sure that, you know, what they put out are standalone novels. It's not something where if you don't know the characters from the game, if you don't know the events going on in kind of the game storyline, that's fine, because this has nothing to do with any of that. And, you know, in terms of exposition, trying to make sure that the book contains everything you need to know. It probably does give readers a sense that it's taking place in kind of a larger world than the book itself really requires. But on the other hand, that's something that I think I try to put a sense of that into a lot of my books anyway, because I like the feeling that the world goes past the edges of the page. So I don't consider that to be kind of a downside to it.
So the country in here is called Rokugan. Mm-hmm. And is that something that came out of the game, or is that?
Yeah. Basically, just about everything about the setting that gets presented in the book is essentially like canon from the game. For people who don't know, it was a collectible card game when it was owned by the previous company. It's now what's called a living card game, which is a slightly different model. And there's also a role-playing game attached to it. And so there were some things that I added to it for the novel, and you know, maybe we'll get around to those. But for the most part, what I'm presenting about the setting is stuff that I'm drawing from previous canon, basically.
And didn't it start off as a role-playing game?
I don't remember the exact history of it. I think the card game was first, but honestly, like, I'm not super up on my early L5R history.
I remember my son getting some of those cards just because he thought they were intriguing.
Yeah.
So do you want to, since we are sort of before we jump into the story itself aspect of this, did you want to address the question that we talked about before the show?
Yeah. So L5R basically is, like, as a setting, it is heavily based on kind of multiple periods of Japanese history, actually, in ways that are very much meant to facilitate the game, I think, because when you're building a setting for something where you want to be able to tell lots of different kinds of stories in it, then you want to build in certain things to facilitate those different kinds of stories. So the setting of Rokugan has like the courtliness of the Heian period, but it also kind of has like the warfare of the Sengoku period. And then a lot of the cultural stuff is actually more like the familiar material culture that we know as like traditional Japanese stuff. A lot of that is actually like Tokugawa era, in terms of, you know, the way people dress and what do buildings look like and so forth. And so it combines those things, and then also like a heavy dose of more like mystical supernatural stuff, so that in L5R you could do a story that's about being, you know, a samurai on the battlefield, or you could do a story that's about being at court and like politicking against people and sending coded messages and such. So it very consciously and deliberately combines those periods in order to create the space to do a wide variety of different stories. Having said that, and this is what we sort of started pre-gaming the broadcast with a little bit. The history of L5R has been interesting because it got started in like the mid 90s, which I'm not going to say that was necessarily like peak sort of fetishization of Japan, and like not
but
necessarily.
There was a lot of that going on. Yeah.
There was a lot of it going on. And the early parts of L5R, like the history of the game, the story, the world, I think has actually been sort of a history of it being slowly dragged away from some of the more problematic things that it started with, like John Wick, one of the, not to be confused with the Keanu Reeves movies, one of the designers who was like kind of the guy that got L5R started, really sort of you know, fetishize the ideas of like honor and like seppuku ritual suicide. If you've, you know, screwed something up, then you should be offering to commit suicide. And just also the idea, like kind of the grimdark thing of, oh, and samurai will just like, you know, cut peasants down if they, you know, mouth off at all. And, you know, it's kind of the like 90s edgelord thing, basically.
Yeah.
And in particular, the thing that I just keep sticking on, because there's no excuse for it fundamentally, earlier editions of L5R absolutely butcher the Japanese language. I'm sorry, Juliet, I'm about to make your ears like bleed.
That's okay. I'm ready.
Like, first of all, for some inexplicable reason, they decided in naming things, instead of using the particle no, they used sano for reasons. But there's a location that was meant to be the Castle of the Swift Sword. And so it is Shiro Sano Ken Hayai, which, as I tell people, translates to, I have a Japanese dictionary and no idea how the language works. Like, that's just bad. And like an hour spent studying Japanese would be enough to tell you that's not how it works. And so fortunately, the game was owned by a company called the Alderac Entertainment Group, or AEG. And then a few years ago, it got sold off to Fantasy Flight Games. And FFG have done a really good job of fixing at least some of the worst stuff. Like, they're now using the Japanese language correctly where it gets used. They know which direction the particle no points in, as opposed to getting it backward. And you know, there were also some things in the setting of like randomly mixing in other East Asian cultures, and there's still some mixtures, but now it's being done in a like, okay, well, let's say the Mantis Islands have more of like a Ryukyuan feel to them, and like the Phoenix maybe are going to have some of the Korean stuff coming in as opposed to flinging it in willy-nilly and such. And also dialing back some of the fetishization of like, yeah, it's not actually that people are committing suicide right, left, and center because honor, like, so they're doing a much better. There is some stuff in it that I wish they had taken the opportunity to fix it when they did a reboot of the setting for their version of it. Even some of it's just on a practical level, like the map makes no sense. Rivers don't work that way. And they could have fixed it, and I wish they had. But also one that you'll see L5R fans kind of perennially chew over is the sort of like founding myth of the Empire of Rokugan is kind of like, number one, it is basically like the whole thing with Kronos eating his children from Greek mythology, but with Japanese names. And you're like, why do we have basically a Greek myth at the heart of this? And that's something that, again, a number of people have been saying, yeah, we kind of wish they'd taken the opportunity to change that. And along with that, some of the spiritual entities in the setting use the names of real Shinto kami, and some of them don't. And it's like, okay, it would have been better if you just not use the names of any real kami, because you've got your own made up mythology around them anyway. So not everything.
Oh yeah, that would be better, I think. Well, I mean, it's a tough issue. I'm glad to see they're making inroads into it.
yeah, and it's just some stuff where it's like a few of the things that were built into the foundation. It's like it would have been nice maybe if we had like jackhammered that a little bit more, but what's being built on top of it is certainly a lot better these days.
And it's and this is a really enjoyable book, with a lot of wonderful detail, and I enjoy it a lot. So as what did you want to bring specifically to this setting that you felt like you could bring with this book?
There were sort of three things, and one of them is literally right there in the title, The Night Parade of 100 Demons. If you know Japanese folklore, it's the hyaki yagyo. It's a concept that shows up in like art and such in Japan, and it's this like chaotic outburst of yokai, these supernatural creatures, just like causing havoc. And there's different versions of the whole night parade concept in some of them, and I used this for the book. Like if you look at either at the night parade or at the leader of the night parade, then just like you die or something. So it's this like really cool folkloric concept that, much to my surprise, over the years of L5R, many of the writers for it have been thoroughgoing nerds who are like, ooh, I read the book about like, the world of the Shining Prince. Let's like take all of these random little court games that they played in the Heian period and let's write up, those into Rokugan. And I was shocked that the Hyaki Yagyo had never been brought in. I'm like, how has nobody done anything with this? Ooh, I get to be the person who does something with it. So that was one of the things I wanted to do with the book. A second one, and this gets back to Fantasy Flight looking for sort of ways that they can kind of do better. They've actually done a fair bit of rebuilding the setting of Rokugan, where number one, it's less sexist, because the early versions of it were like, oh yeah, like female bushi have to be chaste, and if they're not chaste, then they like are supposed to kill themselves or whatever. So it's much more like gender equality in the setting now, and also including same-sex relationships, which in the game storyline, there's a fairly prominent one between two of the important women in the story, but there just hadn't been anywhere yet that there had been like an important relationship between two men. And so when I was pitching this novel, I was like, hey, I kind of want to have it be like that there's a strong romance subplot and have two male main characters so that we can get that in here. And I believe the response I got from my editor at Aconite was in caps, go for it! So they were on board with that. And then the last thing, and this was partly born out of plot necessity, I'm like, okay, I want my two main characters to be dealing with the night parade, but like there's lots of resources and allies and things that could come stampeding in, basically saying, we will fix this problem for you. And I'm like, I don't want them to have those. I want them to have to solve it themselves, even though they're not the right people for the job. And so I was like, well, how about if I have this breaking out in this like isolated mountain village where there is no help to be had for like, you'd have to travel for a week or something to find the people who can help.
I mean, because no matter which era you pick, as long as you're in one of the classical periods, traveling was actually not that quick.
Right. And that's one of the things that's sort of been wildly inconsistent across L5R's history of how big is the empire? Like, how long does it take to get anywhere? Like, we're just going to say it's a while, because you're traveling through the mountains, so even if the distance isn't far, maybe it's just really slow. Okay. But as a result of that, I'm like, okay, I've got my two samurai main characters who are going into this village, and everybody else in the story is a peasant. And that's something that L5R hasn't done much with, just because the game and the story for the game are very much designed to be about the drama and the story of samurai. And so this was a chance to actually look a lot more at the lives of peasants and how samurai interact with them, and how the peasants interact back. And so that was a fun thing to get to add in.
Absolutely. And one of the things that I noticed that you included was, with people dying and the cemeteries, etc., you engaged with the question of who was supposed to deal with the bodies and whether that was a polluting activity.
Right.
Yeah, I was glad to see that.
And it's something too, because the shugenja, which is the term used in the setting for I got more things that I like about what Fantasy Flight has changed. In AEG's days, shugenja were theoretically like kind of priestly, but in actual practice, they were basically wizards, like flinging fireballs around and such. And so it was really nice to get a chance to really look at the more spiritual side of being a shugenja, and have Ryotora worrying about like, okay, well, the monk who had done like some of the burials then died, and so like there hasn't been a proper, like we have not properly laid the spirits to rest, but on the other hand, getting close to death is polluting because of the kind of Shinto side of things that wind up in there. So it allowed me to create some conflict for him.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, I think I like that you were able to nod to the sort of syncretic practices of people in Japan, where they combine the Shinto practices with the Buddhist practices, I mean, it's a very interesting spiritual landscape, I guess, from an outsider's point of view.
Yeah.
Because it's not what I'm used to in the US.
Yeah. Well, and you occasionally get people on the, like, forums and Discord and such for L5R talking about things like, oh, it's really confusing of, what's Shinseism in the setting, which is kind of like the Buddhist thing, and what's Fortunism, which is sort of the Shinto kind of thing. And then also there's this stuff with like, what is and is not a kami is like kind of confusing to them. And like, welcome to how it sort of is in Japan. Like, you're not going to find clear-cut lines between this stuff is Shinto and this stuff is Buddhist, and never the twain shall meet. And also, what is a kami anyway? Like,
yeah. Well, I mean, yeah.
These are complex questions in real-world theology.
Exactly. Well, I mean, I think we have often on the show talked about magic systems and whether they have clear-cut rules and whether they feel more organic. And if you're talking about actual religious practice,
right,
a lot of it is very complex,
which is what I prefer, honestly, like both as a writer and as a reader. If the magic and such are just too clear cut and too mechanistic, and oh yes, we know the rules for how all of this stuff works, then it stops feeling anything like magic to me. So yeah, I like the messier stuff where it's like, yeah, if you look at real world beliefs, they're kind of all over the place sometimes.
Yeah. That's really interesting. Cool. So is there do you have a favorite aspect of this that you brought your geekery to?
I mean, I think the obvious, elephant in the room of this novel is the yokai, because the Night Parade of 100 Demons, like, I think I managed to either show or name drop 67 different kinds of yokai during the course of the novel.
That's a lot of research.
Well, yes, I'll get to the research thing in a second. But yeah, actually, after I'd finished the novel, my editor suggested putting a glossary at the back, like not even so much because people would like need the glossary to understand it, but just that for people who found that interesting, it would be useful to have a spot that they could go look at and see all of it kind of together. So yeah, I had fun putting that together. The research, I've got to continue acknowledging my debt to a guy named Matthew Meyer, who runs the website yokai.com. He has been like blogging about and doing his own art about yokai. He's a guy who lives, I forget where in Japan. He's been living there for a while, and this is just like his passion project, is learning about weird ass supernatural creatures and doing his own art of them. And he's put out 3 books so far. He just finished the Kickstarter for the 4th one that are collections of yokai.
Nice.
So there's The Night Parade of 100 Demons is the first one. It's kind of an obvious title to use. The Hour of Meeting Evil Spirits, the Book of the Hakutaku, and then The Fox's Wedding is the one that will be coming out soon. There are some other books that I read. There's one by Zach Davison that's specifically on supernatural cats. But Meyer's books, like when I sat down to write this, literally the first thing I did was I stacked them up on my desk and started paging through going, okay, I can use that one. And yeah, that doesn't quite fit, but that one definitely.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And I actually, one of the aspects of the book that I really like is the way that even the most powerful human beings in the story are very, very ill matched against what they're up against.
Yeah, I did definitely try to build the Night Parade up into a major enough threat that you're like, okay, individually you could deal with these things, especially because, some of the yokai aren't really directly that dangerous. Like some of them are just sort of poltergeists, like they make noises. It sounds like somebody spilled beans. There you go. That's a yokai. Or I think my favorite, honestly, because it's just so random, is the Mokomokuren, which is if you've got one of your like shoji paper screens and you don't take care of it and don't maintain it and it gets holes in it, and then it might become infested with a Mokomokuren, which are basically these eyeballs that will appear in the holes and blink at you. And that's what it does. And this is funny to me because the Mokomokuren showed up in the 4th edition of the RPG and maybe some earlier ones as well. Except that in an RPG, like if a supernatural creature is in there, then it's got to be like statted up and made into some kind of threat that the PCs can fight. And it's just so sad watching you read through the stat block going, you tried to make the Mokomokuren scary and a threat, and all it really does is blink at you. That's what it's there for. But
there to make you feel guilty about not cleaning and taking care of your
Exactly. But there are things that are much more dangerous than eyeballs blinking at you out of your torn paper screen. It looks like Juliet may have... Oh, there we go. I think you froze briefly.
Yeah, I did. Sorry about that. So, yeah, so I basically heard what you were saying.
Froze up again.
Froze again.
Yeah. I could start babbling.
I think
I have a question.
Okay, Cliff's got a question.
If because Juliet keeps freezing, so
Yeah.
if I can ask a question. You're writing a novel in an existing RPG world, and since this is dive into world building, how do you approach world building when you're taking source material that presumably you cannot contradict and adding stuff to it and fleshing out what you need to write a book, which is a very different enterprise than writing a gaming supplement?
Yeah. I mean, in some respects, it's a bit like world building in historical fiction, because I've written historical fiction as well. And that's, again, something where, okay, here's the setting. And I think there is an aspect of world building which, isn't necessarily about inventing stuff so much as figuring out how to communicate the world to the reader. I think of those as being sort of linked enterprises. So part of it is that. And then part of it is things like, okay, they're going to this village. Well, I still need to decide what that village is like. I made up the village. Say Bomura is something I invented. I did go through a book called The Atlas of Rokugan and looked at different locations to see if there was an existing one I wanted to use. But ultimately I decided, no, going to make up my own village. So now I need to decide things about the village. Like, okay, it's based around a cinnabar mine because that's a really valuable ore. Okay, like deciding stuff like that. And then it's also fun for me to start putting complexity into things that are already in the setting, like stuff about, how the magic works and such. There's a thing that gets brought up in there, which I did. This is sort of an interesting mix of like research / making things up / adding something to a setting that's already, somewhat fixed. Tsukimono Suji, sorry. That is a type of witchcraft from Japanese folklore that involves binding, usually it's kitsune foxes, like these animal spirits, to a family bloodline for basically profit and the downfall of your enemies. And that was something that didn't exist in L5R. I wanted to add it to the story because it was going to help me create some conflicts in a chunk of the story that I was like, there's not enough there. I need more problems. So what can I do here? And so I asked them if I could add Tsukimono Suji to it. But, it's a combination, I think, of there's not much written on that in English that I was able to find. And also, for a fantasy novel, you often need to know concrete details of a sort that folklore doesn't really supply anyway. Like, what is the ritual to become this kind of witch? I don't know. Well, what would fit in Rokugan? Okay, let's make this up. Because, folklore is often disappointingly unspecific on the mechanics, and the fantasy writer needs to know those things.
Well, I also think there's so much variation there,
right?
Regionally and between. It varies a lot.
Yeah.
And if this were actually a chemical recipe for accomplishing something, it might be a little more consistent.
Yeah.
but there's really no necessary need for that, except if you're having to make it concrete for a story.
Exactly. And I mean, that's something that, again, with changes Fantasy Flight has made. They've taken the kind of magic that Shugenja do and made it more complex and variable, where it's like, well, it depends on which clan you're from, how you're going to go about doing that, because they have different traditions. And I like that kind of thing in storytelling because it creates room for me to go, okay, this is how it would normally be done. Here's how I want to do it for my story. So I have now introduced a variant tradition.
Right. I mean, but yay, I'm glad you can do that.
Yeah.
I have a question because
Go ahead, Paul.
I had this mostly sitting in the back pocket, but you mentioned clans, and clans are the most interesting thing I find in L5R. So what clans out of Rokugan, and probably you want to tell the listeners what clans are, did you want to use, and what did you want to bring to those clans that we haven't seen before in the novel?
So yeah, Rokugan is divided into clans. There are 7 great clans and some number of minor clans, depending on what period you're looking at. And this is, again, sort of a game design thing, that each one of the great clans has a very distinct flavor. And I actually think L5R did a great job of, I can look at all of those flavors and go, okay, well, that one's not my cup of tea, but I totally see how somebody else would dig that. There are no great clans I look at and go, why? Like, why are you even here? So in this story, the 2 main characters, I deliberately had one from, had them be from different clans because that makes for more variety and potential conflict. Ryotora is from the Dragon Clan and Seken is from the Phoenix Clan, which are both neighbors sort of in the northern part of Rokugan. And I chose them because those clans, both in their different ways, have more of a kind of like mystical and supernatural focus. The Phoenix are known to be like, they are the religious scholars. They're the ones who kind of developed the type of magic that Shugenja do in the early days of the Empire. The Dragon are more your like mystic weirdos meditating on top of a mountain for 10 years. They're more that
exchange knowledge. Yes.
Yeah. They're actually kind of the most wuxia in some ways of the clans to bring in, a comparison to Chinese stuff. And so they were very well suited for doing a story that's about mystical weirdness happening in an isolated area. If it was the Lion Clan, they'd be like, call in the battalion. They would just smash it with an army.
Exactly.
So they're my favorite clans because of the more spiritual kind of end of things. That's what I enjoy. But then I did want to play against type a bit, because if you mention the Phoenix to people who know L5R, pretty much the first thing they think of is an Isawa Shugenja. The Isawa family are like really, really good Shugenja, like really well respected for their knowledge in that regard. I'm like, okay, so Phoenix character will not be an Isawa. I'm going to have it be I'm going to have
I jumped to the only conclusions.
I'm like, there are other families in the Phoenix clan. How about I pick one of them? And when I first played L5R, I almost designed a scholar from the Asaku family as my character. And so I was like, we're going to have a scholar from the Phoenix. He doesn't know any magic at all, but man, he's a nerd and he has read stuff. So Seken
and he knows kanji.
yes, he does. I made plot out of him being like, yeah, I used to work with somebody who basically did historical linguistics. So let me tell you what we can learn from how the name of this village used to be written.
Yeah, I love that. It works for me.
I had a feeling you would like that, Juliet. It was just a hunch.
but it's not sure. But one of the reasons why I like it is not just because I like that stuff, which naturally I do, but I think there's also a very strong cultural thread that rings really true about it, where there is attention paid to how people write, and there's attention paid to the way that the language has changed over time, and that kind of stuff. So it's not just
you can get.
Linguistics geeks will totally dig this.
Actually, it's a slight digression before I answer the other part of Paul's question with the Dragon Clan. But when I ran my own L5R campaign, I was shocked at how well this went. I told my players, like, poetry is a big deal at court. So like, you should be aware of that. And like, maybe one or more of your characters will decide to write poetry. Well, for our game wiki, we have a page devoted to the poems that my players wrote for the game, including, because my sister is way more fluent in Japanese than I am, many of the poems are now bilingual. We had both the English version and the Japanese version that she helped us write.
Oh, wow.
And the thing that I discovered when we started like trying to do them in both languages was it really unpacked for me why things like haiku like work so well in Japanese, because the amount of like allusion and wordplay that you can get with like, this is a homophone, or like this word, I chose to write it with this other kanji that you wouldn't normally use, but that brings in an additional layer of meaning on top of this single word. Like, wow, you cannot do that in English. It does not work the same way, but it's a huge part of how that art form works in Japanese. So anyway, for the Dragon Clan side of it, I did want a Shugenja in there. So it's an Agasha Shugenja. And then I also like bringing in the vassal families that the main families can have, so that I could have like an element of not exactly class conflict, but like Seken is an Asaku and he comes from like a wealthy and influential family. And then here's Gyotora, who's like, yeah, I'm from this like tiny vassal family that's really not very rich at all. And like, I'm kind of one step above not being a samurai at all. And so he's really insecure when Seken shows up. So I had fun playing with that. And I did manage to work in, I wanted to do more with the fact that the Agasha are also kind of alchemists. At the like stuff that happens at the end of the book, I'm like, I want to work in some kind of like chemical stuff here. Wasn't able to do as much as I wanted, because sadly, if you're in an isolated mountain village with like 3 days to prepare, there's only so much you can do with chemistry. But
true.
Yeah,
you can't access a lot more than you might find in, say, a mine.
Well, yeah, and that's the thing. I was like, it's a cinnabar mine. They've got mercury. Crap, I can't do the things I want to do with mercury. It just doesn't like do what I want. Okay, fine. But yeah, so I had fun sort of taking the clans that were well suited to the kind of story it was, but then deliberately trying to play against type a bit by not having any Sawa.
Excellent.
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the great things about that is that you don't have to necessarily fight the expectations that game players will have for those particular very well-known groups.
Yeah, well, and frankly, like, because there are discussions that happen among fans where they're sitting there going, guys, you remember the Phoenix have other families, right? It's not just the Isawa. So when I, announced the book and I'm like, and one of the characters is an Asako, there were lots of people going, yay! We love the Asako. They deserve more screen time.
Scholars agree.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I love writing nerds. This is a shock, I'm sure, to people who know my work. Really? Marie wrote a nerd who is interested in language? Say it ain't so.
Right? Cool. Well, let's see. There's a lot here. So there's the plethora of yokai. I just think that I found it really interesting the way that you were working with, say, for example, architecture or lack thereof.
That was one where I actually did a bunch of research on Japanese architecture at one point for a project that unfortunately didn't go anywhere. But I had that sort of in my back pocket. And then in particular, I'm like, okay, so Mountain Village. Let me pull up my photographs from when I went to the Hida Folk Village outside of Takayama, where they'll take these like mountain farmhouses that are going to be, they're going to redevelop that land or whatever. They dismantle the farmhouses, they transport them over to this like open air museum and reassemble them there. And so literally I went into my own photo library and I'm like, okay, so this is where they are. Let me take a look at the pictures and remember, how do people live in those houses? And how can we play with that in this story here?
Very cool. Very cool. Well, can you tell us a little bit about, I don't know, I'm guessing you do a lot of things on purpose. So
try to.
It's clear that you wanted to have some interesting gender dynamics. Right. So you want to have the two male samurai, but then you have these very interesting young women characters, and was there a deliberate strategy there? There
was. And I mean, of course, I'm always going to say at least the good things I did were deliberate. The bad ones, totally not deliberate.
Right.
But there have been some things in my career where somebody's like, oh my God, and you did this thing. I'm like, yes, and I totally planned that. But that one I did plan. Yeah, normally I have done books where I do the dual protagonist thing like fairly frequently, actually. It turns out to be something that's common in my work. But usually at least one of them is a woman. Like I don't normally do something where the main characters are all going to be men. And so when I made that decision for the purposes of being able to do a queer romance, I was like, okay, well, I need to make sure that there are women in other parts of the story. Like just because the main characters are men, I'm going to have to like counterbalance that elsewhere, or it's going to annoy me. So yeah, there's a number of female characters who I tried to make sure they would play as prominent roles as possible, just to kind of balance that out.
Yeah. Well, I think that the dynamic of the three young women, it was really interesting.
Yeah, well, and the headman of the village, I had fun playing around with his wife as well, because like there's one bit late in the book where the village is organizing to do something, and the two samurai turn around and they realize it's actually the headman's wife who's actually like spearheading everything, and they're like, isn't that always the way of it? Like it's basically the second in command who actually gets stuff done.
That's fun. Yeah, okay, so sorry, I've got many things teeming in my head. We've touched on some of the language stuff. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about the protagonists specifically? I mean, you told us about their clan affiliation.
Yeah. So I obviously want to make it something where they're not just here to investigate these, weird supernatural disturbances that are happening, but you also want some kind of inner conflict. And this is actually something where I was pulling in something that is from the broader game in terms of a conflict that got added to the setting, or actually a couple of conflicts that got added to the setting when it was rebooted by the new company. One of which is the idea that the Dragon Clan, for reasons that they don't understand, and which, spoiler, are not going to get answered in this book, their birth rate has been declining for a long time. Like small enough that it wasn't super obvious when it began, but the clan is having real problems with they're just not having enough children. And so something that they've started doing, kind of very much in a, we don't want the rest of the empire to realize this is going on. Certain members of the Agasha family, including the vassal family that Ryotora comes from, are traveling around and basically like testing very young peasant children for spiritual merit, and the ones who seem to be sufficiently blessed get adopted as samurai, which the like kind of class or caste differences in Rokugan are actually much stricter than they were in real Japanese history. So this is a big deal. Like saying, yeah, we're going to adopt this peasant kid as a samurai is something that they don't want to get out, because that's going to be seen as really heretical. And so, of course, Ryotora is actually an adopted peasant, and Seibomura, this village, is where he was from. He was adopted when he was a baby, so he remembers nothing about it. But he's going in there being like, somebody around here might be my family, assuming that they weren't killed by the yokai. Right. And like, oh my God, now there's this phoenix here. I really don't want him finding out that I was born a peasant, because, oh my God. And so, building in a lot of tension for him around that. And on top of that, L5R also very much plays up the code of Bushido, which, historically it was really sort of this like thing that Japanese culture sort of retconned into their own history. Like the really formalized notion of Bushido actually came like, after basically the samurai class had been abolished. It was codifying ideas of how people should have behaved before that. But it's very much a central thing in Rokugan. And so poor Ryotora has this feeling of like, I must be perfectly honorable and virtuous in everything that I do in order to make up for the fact that I've been given this like elevation that I don't deserve. So I have to try to like earn it in this life. And poor lad, he has so many issues around that.
Poor lad.
Yeah. And then meanwhile, you've got Seket, who's like, yes, I am, sort of wealthy and privileged, and I've spent most of my time in libraries, and now I'm in a rural village. Things here are kind of dirty. Like, he is so fish out of water. And that was fun to play with. But he's also hiding some stuff, because he's got his own spiritual problems going on that he doesn't want Ryotora to find out about. So people keeping secrets, also a thing that comes up in my fiction.
Yeah, right? Where have I heard that one before?
Well, I mean, after
perhaps the other book behind you.
yeah, like there we go, Mask of Mirrors. After the Lady Trent stuff, where Isabella keeps like no secrets whatsoever about anything, I needed to, step back from being so frank and forward with people.
Cool, very cool. Awesome. Well, so we don't want to be too spoilery. I mean, we are sometimes spoilery here, but
just last week we were talking about spoilers and that we do spoilers on the show.
We do actually do spoilers on the show.
We're being inconsistent.
Honestly, no. This is not a lack of consistency. I just don't want to head straight into spoilers without like having it be a natural sort of outgrowth of the topic.
No. Could you hint around the thing and we can, see how we might?
No, I'm just, shoot. Okay, so I actually was having a couple thoughts. One was about the romance.
Mm-hmm.
I was thinking about the way that you're handling the romance versus, for example, the way that the romance is handled in The Tale of Genji, which of course is actual Japanese literature.
Yeah.
But also I'm thinking of Kij Johnson's The Fox Woman.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that one was modeled more on the sort of basis of the Heian sort of traditions.
Yeah.
So this is probably getting around to, this is probably a Rokugan versus Japan issue. But it seems like there's more tension around that than I expected.
I mean, there is to some extent, like the usual thing in the setting is basically there's definitely a whole thing, especially in the courtly end of the setting of you can, carry on an affair as long as you're like discreet about it and such and don't, embarrass your spouse with it. I am glad that with the same-sex stuff being brought in, like it irritated me that AEG kind of pretended like that doesn't happen. Like, have you looked at Japanese history? That's kind of there canonically.
And literature. And
yeah. But the courtly model of romance, Rokugan does have, and this is one of the ideas that got baked in the early parts and is still kind of around now. The idea that like romantic love is both valorized and viewed with suspicion. Like it's great for you will write poetry and like great art about it and so forth, but at the same time, being romantically in love with somebody can be very destabilizing to what your family needs out of you in terms of political alliances and so forth. So it definitely has a lot of that. That part's not really a concern as much for these two characters, as gets pointed out at one point in the book. The bigger hangups, honestly, are they're personal to the characters. Like for Ryotora, it's very much a thing of I have to be focused on my duty at all times because I have to be the perfectly virtuous man, so I don't get to have nice things. Like that is Ryotora's that is his big romantic obstacle in this book is anything
I don't
that
get
is
to
like,
have nice things.
Yeah, like anything that is like, oh, and then this makes me happy. He's like, no, I don't deserve that. Like,
yeah.
He's got
There's
some
a self-esteem issue there.
Yeah, just a little bit. And second, I had fun playing with the idea that like he's trained as a courtier, and so theoretically he should know people, but he's more the nerd kind of courtier. Like he doesn't actually do a lot of the politicking, and so he's kind of bad at reading things. And his obstacle is a bit more of the wow, like Ryotora is really cool, but like totally wouldn't be interested in me because he has more important things to do. So he completely misses the cues of no, he is totally into you and just denying it. But yeah, I wanted it to be that the obstacles for the two of them, because of the situation they're in, it's not and then, they're both lined up for political marriages and they're not allowed to carry on affairs outside of that. That's not really the concern for them.
No, it's more like we all might die within the next
right. And also, like, the entire book elapses over the course of about 2 weeks. So there's also not a lot of time passing here. But yeah, it was, and the thing that I really found myself making sure I consciously avoided is that the problem is not, and also he's a guy. Like that's not an issue at all. So it's not that it's a same-sex thing, and neither of them really has to worry about the political considerations. It's more, A, we're busy, and B, we both have our personal hang-ups getting in the way here.
Fair enough. Fair enough. The other one was this, the principles cited by, like the virtues, I guess, the
Yeah.
list of virtues.
Yeah.
Is that a
It is,
L5R
yeah,
phenomenon?
it's based on Itabe, I want to say was, I'm forgetting the name of the guy who, like, there was a writer in Japan who like wrote out a codified list of the virtues of Bushido. And
Okay.
it's based heavily on that. There's actually a change that I tried to get them to make when they rebooted the setting, because you both have like honor as a concept, and then one of the tenets of Bushido is also called honor, and I'm like, that's confusing. And also, why don't you just swap it out with self-control, which somehow got cut from the historical list because you wanted 7 instead of 8. Like, whatever. The number 7 crops up a lot in the setting, so I understand why they wanted a list of 7. But I was like, why didn't you leave out the honor one that's confusing and put in self-control, which is all over the place in the way you write the culture? So that was
for sure.
little pet peeve there. But yeah, there is kind of a set list of virtues, and actually there are like shrines in Rokugan to specific virtues. In kind of another of the many fold aspects of the religion.
And so and then another question that I had was the relocation of the mountain god.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, there's a moment in the novel where they kind of move a kami that's enshrined. There's a shrine up on the mountain that got badly damaged in an earthquake. So at one point they're like, well, maybe it will help things if we like get him out of the ruin, or get it out of the ruined shrine and move it down to a place in the middle of the village. And that's actually, there's a book called A Year in the Life of a Shinto Shrine by John K. Nelson. I think K is his middle initial. And that was a really useful book for me on the religion side of things, to look at like, how are Shinto rituals conducted? Like, what are the elements of them? What are the principles behind them? And so I definitely drew on that for the moving a kami, because you do get these rituals in Shinto where either you're like taking a kami from one physical spot and like re-enshrining them in another physical spot, or there's actually a whole process where you kind of I can't think of a way to say this other than you clone the kami. Like, you basically like split off a little bit of them into a new shintai, a new like divine body or vessel for them, and that's how you basically get like daughter shrines of a major shrine. Is they will do
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah, you'll do this ritual to say, okay, this kami is enshrined in this major location, and we kind of want to like, I'm sorry, I don't mean it to sound disrespectful, but I'm like, it's like a franchise operation. Like, you set up your own shrine where you have, I'm forgetting the name of the ritual now, but there is a specific term for this, where you will, basically then like make a version of that for your own shrine from this major one. So I was drawing on those kinds of ideas for them. Moving the mountain kami, it's a little bit of a hybrid thing they invent, and this is something I've also done in stories where it's like, yeah, like by orthodoxy, that's probably not the way you would do it, but you're making do with what you got available. So they're like, okay, we'll treat it sort of like a festival where we, put it into the palanquin and take it down like you do in a lot of matsuri all over Japan, the big festivals that they have. And then we'll kind of like set him up in the village for an extended period of time as if we were moving the shrine. Just wrap some duct tape around it and hope it works.
Yeah. But I mean, it's plausible within the context.
Right. That's what I tried to go for, is like, okay, given what I know of the principles underlying this sort of idea, how would they duct tape it together?
Very cool. Very cool. And I'm glad I'm glad to see that there are some things that are coming straight out of Japanese, Japanese cultural stuff, and not just like it's really interesting to see the blending of the game environment and the thing. I mean, how many different people have written in, fantasized version of X location?
Right.
That is a very common thing. But it's really neat to see you grappling with some of these issues, and I really liked the way you handled it.
I should also acknowledge, I actually wound up emailing John Nelson, the guy who wrote that book, with some questions, and he was very kind in helping me with some answers.
Oh, very cool.
Nice.
Yeah, that's a really
I was
neat
going to
opportunity.
ask you what other research you had done based
Yeah.
on your stuff in Japan and whatnot, and that kind of answers that question. You emailed the
Yeah,
guy who
well,
wrote this book.
and it's interesting too, because frankly, in a way, I didn't do a lot of research for this book because I had done research into Japan before. And so a lot of it was just like, oh, like I read A Year in the Life of a Shinto Shrine years ago as part of that other project. And now it was like, okay, let me pick it up and go, oh, right, there was that one. That'll be a good comparison. Let me reread that part. So yeah, a lot of it was more just sort of the like general library of information already in my head and then doing spot research on specific things.
I find that actually is pretty common, that people sort of spend their lives amassing a hoard of knowledge. And
I guess it only feels odd to me because with the Onyx Court books, I kept having to like shift to a different century of English history with every book. And then with the Memoirs of Lady Trent, she traveled to a different part of the world with every book. And so I spent a chunk of time like not getting to use what I already knew.
Fair. Yeah. But also increasing the amount that you already knew.
Yes, which is what was fun about it, like constantly getting to add more things to the mental, library or compost heap or whatever metaphor I want to use.
It grows great things. Well, very cool. So we are coming right up on 5 o'clock at this point. Any last minute questions?
Mine just got answered, so I'm cool.
Awesome.
Just wondering if you are going to be writing more books in this setting or about these characters.
I am waiting to find out the answer to that question myself. And I will say, they did ask me early on, they were like, would you be open to writing a series with these people? And it took approximately 15 seconds for me to come up with a concept, which the only problem with this concept is if I write more than 2 books, I'm going to have a problem, because the title for the second book would be The Game of 100 Candles, which is also something out of Japanese folklore. It's sort of a weird, like storytelling party game that can have unfortunate spiritual consequences. Like Night Parade of 100 Demons, Game of 100 Candles. What else in Japanese folklore has the word 100 in it? Like, if I do a third book, I have no idea what it'll be.
You can find something, I'm sure.
Yeah, there is actually something in Rokugan, which is not something in Japanese folklore, that is the Bazaar of 100 Fortunes, with fortunes being kind of like sort of kami equivalents of these like gods and such. And like maybe I could do something with that. I don't know, but
it's on the plate waiting for you.
Yeah, so I have sent in a proposal for the Game of 100 Candles. I have not yet heard back.
Well, I hope that works out. Kate, did you have any questions you wanted to ask? Okay, cool. Thank you so much,
Thank
Marie,
you for
coming
having me back yet again. Like, y'all are getting tired of me.
What book is coming out next week?
No, there are no other books currently scheduled until November, when actually just today we publicly announced The Liar's Knot is the title for the sequel to The Mask of Mirrors. That's coming out in November, so you probably will not see me until then at the earliest.
Okay, very cool. Well, hopefully we'll all get a chance to start actually seeing people in actual real life someday.
That would be nice too.
That would be very nice. But this was really fascinating. Thank you so much for coming to tell us about it.
Thank you for having me back.
Lots of Marie Brennan is not a problem.
And it's good to have a chance to like really go straight at the Japan thing that you and I both have going on.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop our broadcast and we can